Part the Second, Chapter 14 of Dick Sands, the Boy Captain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Alex C. Talander, Davis, California. Dick Sands, the Boy Captain, by Jules Verne. Translated by Ellen E. Frewer. Part the Second, Chapter 14, A Ray of Hope. Mrs. Weldon's first feeling on being left alone was a sense of relief at having a week's respite. She had no trust in Negoro's honesty, but she knew well enough that their marketable value would secure them from any personal danger, and she had time to consider whether some compromise might be effected, by which her husband might be spared the necessity of coming to Kazonde. Upon the receipt of a letter from herself, he would not hesitate for a moment in undertaking the journey, but she entertained no little fear that after all perhaps her own departure might not be permitted. The slightest caprice on the part of Queen Moena would detain her as a captive, whilst as to Negoro, if once he should get the ransom he wanted, he would take no further pains in the matter. Accordingly she resolved to make the proposition that she should be conveyed to some point upon the coast, where the bargain could be concluded without Mrs. Weldon coming up the country. She had to weigh all the consequences that would follow any refusal on her part to fall in with Negoro's demands. Of course, he would spend the interval in preparing for his start to America, and when he should come back and find her still hesitating, was it not likely that he would find scope for his revenge in suggesting that she must be separated from her child? The very thought sent a pang through her heart, and she clasped her little boy tenderly to her side. "What makes you so sad, mamma?" asked Jack. "I was thinking of your father, my child," she answered. "Would you not like to see him?" "Yes, yes. Is he coming here?" "No, my boy, he must not come here." "Then let us take Dick and Tom and Hercules and go to him." Mrs. Weldon tried to conceal her tears. "Have you heard from papa?" "No." "Then why do you not write to him?" "Write to him?" repeated his mother. "This is the very thing I was thinking about." The child little knew the agitation that was troubling her mind. Meanwhile Mrs. Weldon had another inducement which she hardly ventured to own to herself for postponing her final decision. Was it absolutely impossible that her liberation should be effected by some different means altogether? A few days previously she had overheard a conversation outside her hut, and over this she had found herself continually pondering. Alvez and one of the Ujiji dealers, discussing the future prospects of their business, mutually agreed in denouncing the efforts that were being made for the suppression of the slave traffic, not only by the cruisers on the coast, but by the intrusion of travellers and missionaries into the interior. Alvez averred that all these troublesome visitors ought to be exterminated forthwith. "But kill one and another crops up," replied the dealer. "Yes, their exaggerated reports bring up a swarm of them," said Alvez. It seemed a subject of bitter complaint that the markets of Nyangwe, Zanzibar, and the Lake District had been invaded by Speke and Grant and others, and although they congratulated each other that the western provinces had not yet been much persecuted, they confessed that now that the travelling epidemic had begun to rage, there was no telling how soon a lot of European and American busybodies might be among them. Thedipo at Kasange and Bihe had both been visited, and although Kazonde had hitherto been left quiet, there were rumours enough that the continent was to be tramped over from east to west. [Footnote: This extraordinary feat was, it is universally known, subsequently accomplished by Cameron.] "And it may be," continued Alvez, "that missionary fellow, Livingstone, is already on his way to us. If he comes there can be but one result. There must be freedom for all slaves in Kazonde." "Freedom for the slaves in Kazonde?" Though these were the words with which, in connection with Dr. Livingstone's name, had arrested Mrs. Weldon's attention, and who can wonder that she pondered them over and over again, and ventured to associate them with her own prospects. Here was a ray of hope. The mere mention of Livingstone's name in association with this story seems to demand a brief survey of his career. Born on the 19th of March, 1813, David Livingstone was the second of 6 children of a tradesman in the village of Blantyre in Lanarkshire. After 2 years' training in medicine and theology, he was sent out by the London Missionary Society, and landed at the Cape of Good Hope in 1840, with the intention of joining Moffat in South Africa. After exploring the country of the Bechuanas, he returned to Kuruman, and having married Moffat's daughter, proceeded in 1843 to found a mission in the Mabotsa Valley. After 4 years he removed to Kolobeng, in the Bechuana district, 220 miles north of Kuruman, whence, in 1849, starting off with his wife, 3 children, and 2 friends, Mr. Oswell and Mr. Murray, he discovered Lake Ngami, and returned by descending the course of the Zuga. The opposition of the natives had prevented his proceeding beyond Lake Ngami at his first visit, and he made a second with no better success. In a third attempt, however, he wended his way northwards with his family and Mr. Oswell along the Chobe, an affluent of the Zambesi, and after a difficult journey at length reached the district of the Makalolos, of whom the chief, named Sebitwane, joined him at Linyante. The Zambesi itself was discovered at the end of June, 1851, and the doctor returned to the Cape for the purpose of sending his family to England. His next project was to cross the continent obliquely from south to west, but in this expedition he had resolved that he would risk no life but his own. Accompanied therefore by only a few natives, he started in the following June, and skirting the Kalahari Desert, entered Litubaruba on the last day of the year. Here he found the Bechuana district much ravaged by the Boers, the original Dutch colonists, who had formed the population of the Cape before it came into possession of the English. After a fortnight's stay he proceeded into the heart of the district of the Bamagonatos, and travelled continuously until the 23rd of May, when he arrived at Linyante, and was received with much honour by Sekeletu, who had recently become sovereign of the Makalolos. A severe attack of fever detained the traveller here for a period, but he made good use of the enforced rest by studying the manners of the country, and became for the first time sensible of its terrible sufferings in consequence of the slave trade. Descending the course of the Chobe to the Zambesi, he next entered Naniele, and after visiting Katonga and Libonta, advanced to the point of confluence of the Liva with the Zambesi, where he determined upon ascending the former as far as the Portuguese possessions in the west. It was an undertaking, however, that required considerable preparation, so that it was necessary for him to return to Linyante. On the 11th of November he started again. He was accompanied by 27 Makalolos, and ascended the Liva Till, in the territory of the Balonda. Here he reached a spot where it received the waters of his tributary the Macondo. It was the first time a white man had ever penetrated so far. Proceeding on their way, they arrived at the residence of Shinte, the most powerful of the chieftains of the Balonda, by whom they were well received, and having met with equal kindness from Katima, a ruler on the other side of Lemba, they encamped, on the 20th of February, 1853, on the banks of Lake Dilolo. Here it was that the real difficulty commenced, the arduous travelling, the attacks on the natives and their exorbitant demands, the conspiracies of his own attendants and their desertions, would soon have caused any one of less energy to abandon his enterprise. But David Livingstone was not a man to be daunted. Resolutely he persevered, and on the 4th of April reached the banks of the Coango, the stream that forms the frontier of the Portuguese possessions, and joins the Zaire on the north. 6 days later he passed through Cassange. Here it was that Alves had seen him. On the 31st of May he arrived at St. Paul de Luanda, having traversed this continent in about 2 years. It was not long, however, before he was off again, following the banks of the Coanza, the river which was to bring such trying experiences to Dick Sands and his party. He reached the Lombe, and having met numbers of slave caravans on his way, again passed through Cassange, crossed the Coango, and reached the Zambesi at Kewawa. By the 8th of the following June he was again at Lake Dilolo, and descending the river he re-entered Linyante. Here he stayed till the 3rd of November, where he commenced his second great journey, which was to carry him completely across Africa, from west to east. After visiting the famed Victoria Falls, the intrepid explorer quitted the Zambesi and took a north-easterly route, the transit of the territory of the Patokas, a people brutalized by the inhalation of hemp, a visit to Simalemboni, the powerful chief of the district, the passage of the Kafoni, a visit to King Mburuoma, an inspection of the ruins of Zumbo, an old Portuguese town, a meeting with the chief Mpende, at that time at war with the Portuguese. These were the principal events of this journey, and on the 22nd of April Livingstone left Tete, and having descended this river as far as its delta, reached Kilimane, just 4 years after his departure from the Cape. On the 12th of July he embarked for the Mauritius, and on the 22nd of December, 1856, he landed in England after an absence of 16 years. Loaded with honours by the geographical societies of London and Paris, brilliantly entertained by all ranks, it would have been no matter of surprise if he had surrendered himself to a well-earned repose, but no thought of permanent rest occurred to him, and on the 1st of March, 1858, accompanied by his brother Charles, Captain Bedingford, Dr. Kirk, Dr. Miller, Mr. Thornton, and Mr. Baines, he started again, with the intention of exploring the basin of the Zambesi, and arrived in due time at the coast of Mozambique. The party ascended the great river by the Congoan mouth. They were on board a small steamer named the Ma Robert, and reached Tete on the 8th of September. During the following year they investigated the lower course of the Zambesi and its left affluent, the Shire, and having visited Lake Shirwa, they explored the territory of the Manganyas, and discovered Lake Nyassa. In August 1860 they returned to the Victoria Falls. Early in the following year Bishop Mackenzie and his missionary staff arrived at the mouth of the Zambesi. In March an exploration of the Rovuma was made on board the Pioneer, the exploring party returning afterwards to Lake Nyassa, where they remained a considerable time. The 30th of January 1862 was signalized by the arrival of Mrs. Livingstone, and by the addition of another steamer, the Lady Nyassa, but the happiness of reunion was very transient. It was but a short time before the enthusiastic Bishop Mackenzie succumbed to the unhealthiness of the climate, and on the 27th of April Mrs. Livingstone expired in her husband's arms. A second investigation of the Rovuma soon followed, and at the end of November the doctor returned to the Zambesi and reascended the Shire. In the spring of 1803 he lost his companion, Mr. Thornton, and as his brother and Dr. Kurt were both much debilitated, he insisted upon their return to Europe, while he himself returned for the third time to Lake Nyassa, and completed the hydrological survey which already he had begun. A few months later once more found him at the mouth of the Zambesi. Thence he crossed over to Zanzibar, and after 5 years' absence arrived in London, where he published his work, The Exploration of the Zambesi and its Affluents. Still unwearied and insatiable in his longings, he was back again in Zanzibar at the commencement of 1866, ready to begin his fourth journey, this time attended only by a few sepoys and negroes. Witnessing on its way some horrible scenes which were perpetrated as the result of the prosecution of the slave trade, he proceeded to Makalose, on the shores of Lake Nyassa, where nearly all his attendants deserted him, and returned to Zanzibar with the report that he was dead. Dr. Livingstone meanwhile was not only alive but undaunted in his determination to visit the country between the two lakes Nyassa and Tanganyika. With none to guide him except a few natives, he crossed the Loangona, and in the following April discovered Lake Liemba. Here he lay for a whole month hovering between life and death, but rallying a little he pushed on the north shore of Lake Moero. Taking up his quarters at Cazambe for 6 weeks, he made 2 separate explorations of the lake, and then started farther northwards, intending to reach Ujiji, an important town upon Lake Tanganyika. Overtaken, however, by floods, and again abandoned by his servants, he was obliged to retrace his steps. 6 weeks afterwards he had made his way southwards to the great lake Bangweolo, whence once more he started towards Tanganyika. This last effort was most trying, and the doctor had grown so weak that he was obliged to be carried, but he reached Ujiji, where he was gratified by finding some supplies that had been thoughtfully forwarded to him by the Oriental Society at Calcutta. His great aim now was to ascend the lake, and reach the sources of the Nile. On the 21st of September he was at Bambare, in the country of the cannibal Manyuema, upon the Lualaba, the river afterwards ascertained by Stanley to be the Upper Zaire or Congo. At Mamobela the doctor was ill for 24 days, tended only by 3 followers who continued faithful, but in July he made a vigorous effort, and although he was reduced to a skeleton, made his way back to Ujiji. During this long time no tidings of Livingstone reached Europe, and many were the misgivings lest the rumours of his death were only too true. He was himself, too, almost despairing as to receiving any help. But help was closer at hand than he thought. On the 3rd of November, only 11 days after his return to Ujiji, some gunshots were heard within half a mile of the lake. The doctor went out to ascertain whence they proceeded, and had not gone far before a white man stood before him. "You are Dr. Livingstone, I presume," said the stranger, raising his cap. "Yes, sir, I am Dr. Livingstone, and I am happy to see you," answered the doctor, smiling kindly. The two shook each other warmly by the hand. The new arrival was Henry Stanley, the correspondent of the New York Herald, who had been sent out by Mr. Bennett, the editor, in search of the great African explorer. On receiving his orders in October 1870, without a day's unnecessary delay, he had embarked at Bombay for Zanzibar, and after a journey involving considerable peril, had arrived safely at Ujiji. Very soon the two travellers found themselves on the best of terms, and set out together on an excursion to the north of Tanganyika. They proceeded as far as Cape Magala, and decided that the chief outlet of the lake must be an affluent of the Lualaba, a conclusion that was subsequently confirmed by Cameron. Towards the end of the year Stanley began to prepare to return. Livingstone accompanied him as far as Kwihara, and on the 3rd of the following March they parted. "You have done for me what few men would venture to do. I am truly grateful," said Livingstone. Stanley could scarcely repress his tears as he expressed his hope that the doctor might be spared to return to his friends safe and well. "Good-bye," said Stanley, choked with emotion. "Good-bye," answered the veteran feebly. Thus they parted, and in July 1872 Stanley had landed at Marseilles. Again David Livingstone resumed his researches in the interior. After remaining 5 months at Kwihara, he he gathered together a retinue consisting of his faithful followers, Susi, Chuma, Amoda, and Jacob Wainwright, and 56 men sent to him by Stanley, and lost no time in proceeding towards the south of Tanganyika. In the course of the ensuing month the caravan encountered some frightful storms, but succeeded in reaching Mura. They had previously been in extreme drought, which was now followed by the rainy season, which entailed the loss of many of the beasts of burden, in consequence of the bites of the tsetse. On the 24th of January they were at Chitunque, and in April, after rounding the east of Lake Bangweolo, they made their way towards the village of Chitambo. At this point it was that Livingstone had parted company with certain slave dealers, who had carried the information to old Alvez that the missionary traveller would very likely proceed by way of Loanda to Kazonde. By the 13th of June, the very day before Negoro reckoned on obtaining from Mrs. Weldon the letter which should be the means of securing him $100,000, tidings were circulated in the district that on the 1st of May Dr. Livingstone had breathed his last. The report proved perfectly true. On the 29th of April the caravan had reached the village of Chitambo, the doctor so unwell that he was carried on a litter. The following night he was in great pain, and after repeatedly murmuring in a low voice, "Oh dear, oh dear," he fell into a kind of stupor. A short time afterwards he called up Susi, and having asked for some medicine, told his attendant that he should not require anything more. "You can go now." At about 4 o'clock next morning, when an anxious visit was made to his room, the doctor was found kneeling by his bedside, his head in his hands, in the attitude of prayer. Susi touched him, but his forehead was icy with the coldness of death. He had died in the night. His body was carried by those who loved him, and in spite of many obstacles was brought to Zanzibar, whence, 9 months after his death, it was conveyed to England. On the 12th of April, 1874, it was interred in Westminster Abbey, counted worthy to be deposited among those whom the country most delights to honour. End of Part the Second, Chapter 14. Recording by Alex C. Talander, Davis, California. www.alexctalander.com